Hello everyone, welcome to another video for the History Valley. I am Jacob Bremen, and today I am joined by Jason Foux, also known as Dragons in Genesis. And today we're going to be discussing Mythicism, the idea that Jesus did not exist, that he was originally an angel in early Christianity before he underwent Euhemerism. Basically, we're going to be discussing Paul's letters, Paul having a different understanding of Jesus versus how the gospel offers, having a full biography, four different um, uh, outlooks of the biography of Jesus, as we all know that they don't necessarily agree with each other on what happened during Jesus' life. There are things that they do agree on, and there are many things that they don't agree on. So let's begin. All right, so Jason, what led you on the path to becoming a mythicist? What were the circumstances that led up to that point?
Um, I guess my first brush with it happened about 10 years ago. I was looking for more biblical studies materials, and I found a book by David Fitzgerald called Nailed 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All. And when I looked at the book and I read the description on the back, I basically laughed about it. I thought the guy was a quack. Um, I thought it was complete rubbish, and I put the book back.
Hmm.
I thought he was an idiot and a conspiracy theorist because, I mean, of course there had to be a guy. How else do religions get started? Um, and I didn't give the topic a single thought again for about another 5 years. And then I was listening to an episode of The Thinking Atheist, and David Fitzgerald was on there with Dr. Richard Carrier and Dr. Robert Elm Price, and they were talking about this topic. Now, I already knew a little bit about Dr. Price. I had some of his books, and when I was listening to these three talk about this topic on there, about the idea that the early concept of Jesus was more of a celestial figure than an actual man on earth, I realized that if even half of what they said was true, I had some gaping holes in my knowledge. So I went back and I started reading, more about this topic, about mythicism, about what we know about the historical Jesus and everything else, trying to get a better grasp of the actual topic, because I couldn't make an informed decision unless I was at least somewhat informed. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized that the mythicism case was much stronger than I had been led to believe. It wasn't just a conspiracy theory. It wasn't, this bogus topic. It actually had some meat to it. And the historicist argument had a lot of problems. Now, that didn't completely convince me. What ultimately convinced me was when I was listening to some lecture series by Bart Ehrman, and he came on and essentially said that anyone who believes that Jesus was a myth, um, they're basically just wrong, they're misinformed, and all of these other things. And so I said, okay, if this guy is this strong historicist, and he's an expert on early Christianity. I mean, no one can dispute that. He must
Right.
have the answer. And so I just started looking at what he had on the historical Jesus, and ultimately it was Bart Ehrman who convinced me that the mythicist case was in fact the strongest position right now, because his arguments for the historical Jesus were, if you don't believe in historical Jesus, then you're just a crank. It's an absurd view. It's a bogus theory and everything else. But he couldn't put forth any evidence to back this up. And he would say things like, well, everyone with a PhD believes in a historical Jesus except the mythicist, which is kind of the definition of a mythicist, right? And so it was it was fallacious arguments was the best I could get from even the strongest historicist. Um, and so until someone gives me something better, I kind of don't have a choice but to be a mythicist. And so it was sort of a weird little journey that began with David Fitzgerald and ended with Bart Ehrman. Um, and I thought the mythicists were, conspiracy theorists nuts. Um, and ultimately, a historicist convinced me that the mythicists had, at the moment, the better argument.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, some of the things that Bart Ehrman does say are quite odd. Um, the things that he has said about people that that do not subscribe to the idea that a historical Jesus existed and he was simply a man. Um, they often do say those things that any if you don't believe in what the majority say, you're just wrong, and which is a jumping the
Yeah,
bandwagon fallacy. And it just doesn't make any
yeah,
sense. And
right,
and the
right.
and the and also what a lot of people don't understand is just because a PhD says something doesn't make it true either. They have a PhD because they studied very well on the subject that they have a PhD for, but it doesn't
Mhm.
mean that they got it all figured out too.
Right. Well, I mean, 40 years ago, the majority of PhDs thought that Moses was a historical figure.
Right.
And the first people to present the idea that he was actually a composite character based on older stories, uh, a lot of those people, they caught the same kind of heat that your mythicists are currently catching. There was one in particular, I cannot remember his name, but he ended up losing his job at the university where he was teaching because he was basically saying that Moses was a myth. And now that's the consensus view, not just among secular scholars, but among Jewish scholars, even. Um, it's just a given that Moses and the patriarchs are fictional characters. And so we're seeing the same thing happening now. People are starting to question it and demanding the evidence that should that these scholars should be presenting if they're going to espouse such a strong conviction that the man
Right.
existed. We need the evidence to support that conviction, and to date, they have completely failed to provide that. They just provide fallacious arguments, and that's a problem. That doesn't mean that Jesus didn't exist. It
Right.
just means that the historicist case has there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and they're simply not doing it. They're just relying on these old assumptions.
Right. Yeah, the historicist argument, I admit, in a lot of cases, has been in the way that it's been presented, has come off very weak, and there does need to be an overhaul if it's going to continue to be convincing. Because here's the other issue: even if a Jesus was crucified during the reign of Pontius Pilate, what's to say that he wasn't another part of the composite Jesus? Because Paul
Right,
does not mention Pilate one time in any of his letters. Not even the pseudepigraphical letters mentions Pilate. None of them,
right.
which is odd. And one could say, well, he was crucified, and typically, God isn't crucified in heaven. It matches a crucifixion that's supposed to happen on earth because Romans crucified people. But then why did Paul say things like, okay, well, he became a man in Philippians. Like he's coming down, he's becoming a man all of a sudden. Very strange vaguenesses. It even sounds like Paul. One could put it. It sounds like that Paul is tap dancing around the theology,
Hmm.
uh, being very vague. Like he's having a hard time describing what he wants to describe.
Right.
And it looks like that the New Testament is simply over time evolving the Jesus character, adding new material to him that the earlier material doesn't have, like in Hebrews, which is claimed to have been written by Paul, but it wasn't. It espouses the idea that Jesus was a high priest, just like First Clement
Mm.
does. that Jesus was a high priest. And then later on, you get Mark, um, and Mark adds in Mary and Martha, which is very similar to the both his sisters, Mary and Martha, mentioned in the Talmud, the sisters of
Hmm.
Jesus ben Gamala, a high priest in the early 60s, whom was confused with Jesus too. You have so many
Right.
characters being confused with Jesus. The massacre of the innocents in the beginning of Matthew is based on
Hmm.
the one, the Exodus. Moses,
Right.
just like Moses, the Exodus story is based on the Hyksos. It's based on Sargon the Great, and it's based on numerous different myths
Right.
simultaneously. So, you know,
Yeah. The it looks, at least to me, like this idea of Jesus had existed possibly for centuries, and somewhere along the way, historic details of real people were sort of collected and added on to this character. And most of these characters were people who were named Jesus.
right.
The problem is, it's not one; it's a bunch of them.
Yeah.
And but we also have details from people who were not named Jesus, who lived in completely different time periods. Um, like we have this thing. It's a prophecy that is referenced in this one section of the book of Enoch called the Animal Apocalypse, and this prophecy, like most prophecies, is actually written after the events it discusses, and it's talking about was it I cannot remember the guy's name now. Anyway, it's talking about this guy who rallied a bunch of Jews together and launched this big revolt. And along the way, he came along and he cleansed the temple of all these Greek statues that had been placed in there. He took them all out, discarded them, and then I believe he anointed himself as high priest. And we find this, you know, we see this in the book of Enoch, like I said, in the Animal Apocalypse. And when it's set up in there, of course, it uses all this weird imagery and everything else because that's what Enoch does. That was common with apocalyptic literature. But Christians, even today, read that and say, oh, look, this is a prophecy concerning Jesus, instead of Judas Maccabeus, the the Jewish general who basically did all of this stuff. And so we have this
Right.
cleansing of the temple, um, that is not only used as a prophecy for Jesus, but may actually have been used as um, a source of biographical information for the gospel Jesus, because that's one
Absolutely.
of the main things that Jesus does. It's actually the reason why he is crucified in some of the gospels. And so there are actually other parallels between the story of Judas Maccabeus and the story of Jesus, like being betrayed by some of his own people. That's also mentioned in Enoch, and multiple other things. Um, but yeah, so it looks like this mythical Jesus had existed for, like I said, maybe for centuries. We have references to him in things like in Isaiah and Zechariah. They talk about this celestial figure, and this is long before Christianity. But
Right.
then, sometime during the Roman influence on in Palestine, he gets historicized, and they grab details of actual people to fill out his bio. Um, but even some
Right.
early Christians, I believe Origen, actually said that if you're reading the Gospels as literal, then you're missing the point. They were meant to be understood as allegory.
Yeah.
So there we have, centuries after Christianity came into being, people were still believing that the Gospels were an allegory. They actually meant something other than what they literally said. There was a deeper meaning, and that may actually be the story of the celestial Jesus. About, the Romans could have been stand-ins for the great archons that crucified Jesus up in the sky. You know, which I think that's what the Gospel of Mark was supposed to be, an allegory for the celestial drama.
Even Galatians chapter 4 says to take things such as Abraham as an allegory.
Yeah, yeah, it's there's we have to understand that the early Christians, and they, like you just mentioned,
Hmm.
they used allegory constantly. And I mean, it was a mystery religion. Using allegory, it was a defining characteristic. And Paul talks about this repeatedly in his letters, that to understand something, when you're first initiated into the cult, you are given the details in one form, and he uses milk. You're like babes, and you can only drink milk. And this is basically him saying that when you first come into the cult, you're getting a different version of events so that you can better understand it, to simplify the matter. And once you ascend through the ranks of the mystery faith, you are given more and more information once you're ready for it, and eventually you become like adults ready to eat meat. And this is not only frequently used by Paul to talk about the information that members of the congregation are given, but this was common language in mystery cults in the Mediterranean world.
Absolutely.
Initiates were told one thing, and they actually called it milk. They used the food analogy. And once they ascended through the ranks, they were ready for the meat. And so something like the Gospel of Mark, that may be the milk, the simple version to make it easy for you to understand. And then eventually you come to learn that no, it wasn't people on earth, it was spirits up in the sky. Jesus wasn't a man, Jesus was a deity. And if you understand that, then suddenly things like the Gospel of Mark, they make more sense, because people in the ancient world didn't think Mark was historically accurate. They actually faced criticism for that. People pointed out things like how he has all these adventures on the Sea of Galilee, but at the time there was no body of water called the Sea of Galilee. It wasn't until centuries later that Lake Kinneret was renamed Sea of Galilee to make Mark, match geography. And people pointed this out. And, you know, that's when you had these defenders of Christianity saying, no, you're not supposed to think that there's a real Sea of Galilee. You're missing the point. It's not about a body of water. There's a deeper meaning.
Right.
And that's why I think that Mark was just supposed to be understood as allegory. And if we try to understand it as history, then, like those earlier Christians said, we're missing the point.
Yeah, Mark's Jesus is definitely a compendium of many things. Uh, Jesus ben Zaphias, whom led 600 fishermen against Commander Vespasian on 67 CE.
Hmm.
They were Galilean fishermen, and Vespasian sent his troops to have them speared down.
Hmm.
And it's very similar to Mark talking about the fishers of men, and then
Yeah.
yeah, then we also have Jesus ben Ananus, whom a lot of people talk
Hmm.
about, preaching apocalypse that woe unto you, woe unto me as well. Jerusalem will be destroyed, just like the apocalypse in Mark 13, the
Hmm.
Olivet Discourse. So you have Jesus imitating different people, including
Right.
even the Egyptian false prophet at the Mount of Olives, which
Hmm.
he took over his role as preaching at the Mount of Olives. Instead of it being about war, it's about peace and love. So it's
Hmm.
twisting the story to fit the allegory of what Mark is trying to teach his
Hmm.
followers.
Yeah. We even have other things taken straight out of the Old Testament, like in the coronation of Solomon. You know, he goes down to essentially be baptized in this thing of water. He is proclaimed king. He uh, rides triumphant into Jerusalem on a donkey. There's this great crowd of people, all singing his praises. And then eventually he goes on to be seated on the throne of heaven. There's a great earthquake. Uh, or I'm sorry, Solomon goes on to be seated on the throne, which the Jerusalem throne is meant to be the throne of heaven.
Right.
And there's like this great earthquake and the ground splits open. And we see these same things happening with Jesus, where, you know, he first goes and he's baptized, and eventually he goes over to Jerusalem, and he then rides in triumphant on a donkey. People start to recognize him as the King of the Jews. He ascends up into heaven. He's seated on the throne of heaven. There's this great earthquake that splits the ground open. This is a coronation imagery that we're looking at here, and it's being used as biographical information for this character. If he really existed, you wouldn't need to do that. I mean, you could, and certainly people take fiction and insert it into stories about real people. That happens all the time. But with the story of Jesus, it looks like that's all they're doing. Richard Carrier actually has this huge article where he goes through the story of Jesus as you find it in the Gospel of Mark, which is our oldest reference to a historical Jesus. And every single scene comes from somewhere else. So if you literally blot out every scene that was taken from another story about another person, you would be left with nothing. You would literally have nothing left for the historical Jesus. So if, as Robert Price said, if there was a historical Jesus, there isn't anymore. His biography is lost. All we have is the myth.
Right. He's been divorced from history. Theologically. Um, yeah, that is the issue. Because even if there were a historical Jesus in the 30s that was crucified by Pilate, um, which in my view, um, I do think that there was, in my view, but I do admit the problem is is he just another part of the composite Jesus?
Mm-hmm.
Or was he the Jesus that was discussed from the very beginning?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's still a way for someone to be a mythicist, even believing those things. Like if this Jesus is another part of the amalgam biography of Jesus in the Gospels, but is not the
Mm-hmm.
one taught by Paul, then we still get nothing.
Right. Yeah. So that's one of the things that's really curious about this is that even if there was a historical figure, we still have Christians on multiple continents who didn't believe in that.
That's
You
right.
know,
Yeah.
they talk about like 1 Corinthians 8 talks about, Jesus, he was created at the beginning of time, and he was then used as an instrument to bring about the rest of creation. Um,
Like Philo's
and he
logos.
was right, right. He was the son of El Elyon, the God Most High. That's in 1 Thessalonians 1. Galatians 4 talks about him like an angel. Um, Philippians 2 and Romans 1 says that this spirit entered into a body of flesh that was made out of David's sperm. This is a detail borrowed straight out of Zoroastrianism, where the sperm of Zarathustra was stored in a magic lake, and it would in the future be used for their Messiah, the Saoshyant. It would be used to create an earthly body for him, and then the spirit of Zarathustra could then come to Earth. So the idea that he's descended from David is a Zoroastrian idea. It's part of where the whole messianic movement came from.
Also,
Um,
also the first Seoshot was supposed to defeat Ahriman at the end of time. Very
mhm.
much how Jesus' second coming would defeat Satan at the last
Right,
days.
right. Yeah, and so you have, like the whole purpose for Jesus is a Persian idea, and if you take, um, if you take post-exilic Judaism and you throw in some Zoroastrianism, there are several ways you could mix those ingredients together and come up with something that looks a great deal like Christianity.
Absolutely.
You look at the Qumran sect; they were basically Christians. Some people actually believe that they were Christians, and so these were people who they didn't need a historical Jesus to be Christians, and they weren't even our only groups. There were dozens of these. Josephus talks about some of them. So we basically got Christianity before
Jesus.
Christianity.
Yeah.
We've got it maybe going back to 300 BC.
I remember talking
And
about that uh, on a video I did a couple years ago about Christianity 300 years before Jesus. Yeah. And other people have
yeah,
discussed that too. And the thing is, it's so obvious that that is something I think is clear because take Philo for example. Philo believes in the Logos. He is in a strange way the Son of God, but somehow God Himself because the Logos is the body of God and the body is the Son of God. But
hmm
yet that they have the same consciousness. He said some strange things like that, just like Jesus is portrayed in the New Testament, and yet it's not Jesus. So we
right.
have a Christian-like religion before Jesus. And even the forgery, the Hadrian's letter in the Historia Augusta talked about, although this text isn't portraying it correctly, it talks about it takes Serapis for example, and it tries to say that the cult of Serapis called themselves the bishops of Christ.
hmm
So it is similar. It's an awareness, a late awareness that there was a Christianity before Jesus. Maybe not
hmm
necessarily in the fashion it puts it, but there we go.
Right, right. Yeah, there are so many parallels, you know, between Christianity and these early mystery cults. I mean, Christianity is a Jewish messianic mystery religion. That's the definition of Christianity. Um,
Certainly.
and when you begin to understand what these mystery cults were, how they functioned, what they taught, well, then it makes perfect sense. And historicizing the deities, that's what those mystery cults did. Like all, if not all, then almost all of them. I don't actually know of a single one that did not euhemerize its deity.
Right.
And um, this was common practice. It was a trend. It's actually, if the Jews didn't do it until the first century AD, then it, the noteworthy part is that it took them that long to do it. But what's funny is if you look at some of these stories about Jesus, about their Messiah, it looks like they actually did it several times. Um, in around the area of Babylon, they have a completely different Jesus as their founder of Christianity for the Christians who lived there. And he had 5 disciples instead of 12. And he was killed by stoning instead of crucifixion. And so we're talking about a completely different historical Jesus here.
Yeah, that's in
So either Jesus kept, the Son of God kept popping up, like a messianic whack-a-mole, and
right.
people kept killing him, or Christians, while they were historicizing, euhemerizing their Messiah, different groups were doing it at different times and putting him in different points in their history, which is exactly what you see with a Euhemerized figure.
Exactly. Um, yeah, I think that person you were just talking about is in the Talmud, Yeshu ben Stata or ben Pandira. I remember him
Yeah,
having
yeah.
five disciples. Um,
Yeah, and they basically sent people out for 40 days asking for witnesses to come forward to testify on his behalf and things like that.
Sounds like the 40
Yeah,
days in the
yeah,
wilderness.
yeah. But yeah, it was it's basically another attempt for Christianity to historicize their founder. And like if Jesus had existed, this shouldn't happen. We would know when he lived and died, and we wouldn't have to try to say, well, maybe it was during this time period, or maybe it was over there.
Right.
I mean, it's not impossible to do that, but it's far more difficult if the events are actually known.
It is.
And this Jesus supposedly died like in 75 BC. So like we're talking about a century window for his death. Was it 75 BC or was it 30 AD or anywhere in between? Those are only two. We have others, so
Right.
it's it's problematic. Any way you look at it, there are Christians made multiple attempts to place their Jesus in history, and all of those attempts run into difficulties when you attempt to match it up with actual history.
Absolutely. Yeah, because when I look at the Gospels, I see them as four different attempts to harmonize different Christianities together
Hmm.
to create one solid Jesus that
Right.
combines contradictory elements together to account for different beliefs. And to this day, there are people out there that try to reconcile contradictions in the Gospels, and many of these contradictions are deliberate because they were gluing together contradictory things about Jesus that cannot be harmonized, that cannot be rectified. Like, when was Jesus born? 4 BCE, or was he born in 6 CE? Matthew
Right.
or Luke? Um, how many women went to see him in the tomb? Depends on which gospel you read, even as Bart Ehrman would say. Depends on which
Right.
gospel you read.
And what did they find in the tomb? Was it a man in white? Was it two men in white? Was it an angel? Two angels? You know,
Right.
um, and what's funny about that is like, according to Mark, the women they just went over to the tomb and they just strolled in and then they left and never told anyone what they saw. But then at some point after that, people were saying, well, couldn't someone have stolen the body? So Matthew comes along and says, "Oh no, 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 no! It would be impossible to steal the body because the Romans were guarding the tomb. Like, why would the Romans care if
Right.
like some troublemaker had his body stolen?
Right.
There were grave robbers all the time. And the Romans they didn't dedicate resources to
Absolutely.
guarding these tombs to prevent this, especially. And the reason
Right.
it gives, oh well, if they stole the body, then the disciples could claim that it was stolen or that he had resurrected. What the Romans were worried that another mystery cult would pop up worshiping a dying and rising God. Like that's what half the Roman Empire believed. It
Yeah.
makes no sense, you
Right.
know. Uh, yeah, yeah, and like no one else seems to know anything about that. Sort of like the great earthquake, and then all the I'm sorry, not the earthquake, all the zombies. Uh, you know, Jesus dies on the cross, and suddenly it's Night of the Living Dead in Jerusalem, and there's like zombies running around everywhere, and everybody saw him.
Right.
Um, but no one outside of I believe that was Matthew, no one outside of the author of that one gospel thought to write it down, including the authors of all the other gospels, um, including Mark, who was Matthew's source for his gospel information. So yeah, it's they, the reason they have these contradictions is because they were all trying to tell different stories, you know?
Right.
And I believe it's John actually says that. Oh, there are all these other gospel writers out there, but none of them got it right. I'll give you the real story. And then he goes on and he reboots the whole gospel. Um, yeah, they weren't recording history. They don't even attempt to. They're all writing stories, you know. Um, which is why none of them name their sources, even though we know their sources. They're all using Mark. So
Right.
yeah, it's bizarre. Well, it's only bizarre if you try to think of it as history. Uh, but if you
Right.
just read it as literature, oh, it makes perfect sense. These were Greek novels that were allegory for a mystery cult, and you do that, then you don't have to explain anything because it's all self-explanatory. It makes perfect sense then.
Right. Well, all right. I think that just about covers it. What do you think?
Yeah, and I mean, if you want to talk more about, the like who this celestial Jesus was, um, because I was recently talking to somebody about like some of the details of this celestial Jesus and like what the Christians believed about him. Um,
Right.
so I don't know if you wanted to do that. Let's see.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Sure.
Uh, yeah, like one of the things that I did as sort of an experiment, and I convinced a few other people, some of my listeners, to do, was to take the New Testament and rearrange the books in chronological order. Take the 7 authentic letters of Paul and put those up in the beginning, and
Right.
move the Gospels way toward the end. And when you do that, you can not only see the gradual evolution of the idea of Christianity, but the New Testament itself, when read in chronological order, actually tells you that Jesus never existed. It actually tells you that he was a celestial figure. Um, you read 1 Corinthians 10, and it tells you that Jesus is Yahweh, and he is the one who led Moses through the desert, during the Exodus and subsequent books. Um, it says that whenever he descended from the highest heaven to this lower realm, most likely the firmament, in Philippians 2:6-11, it says that he had no magical powers. He could not work miracles. So all the miracle stories that we have in the Gospels, the early Christians didn't believe that Jesus could do anything like that because when he was in a human body, he had no magic powers. He had to be fully mortal so he could be killed by the sky demons.
Right.
Um, he it Paul doesn't know anything about him being handed over by Judas after the Last Supper. According to Romans 8:32, he was handed over by his father, by God, by El Elyon. Um, and 1 Corinthians 2 says that he was killed by angels, not by Romans. Um, Hebrews 9, which wasn't written by Paul, it was written by someone else, but it expresses no knowledge of the gospel material. Hebrews 9:11 says that Jesus' death occurred in a heavenly tabernacle. It specifically states Jesus died in heaven, not on earth. Um, and later in there, it says that he was never on earth. Um, I'm trying to, was that Hebrews 8 or 10? Somewhere around there. It actually says that if Jesus had been on earth, he wouldn't have been a priest. So it actually says Jesus was never on
That's in
earth.
Hebrews 7. Yep.
Hebrews 7, okay. Um,
Hebrews
You
4 also
know,
talks about Jesus being a high priest too.
right, right. And we see this. This seems to be a reference to material that we saw in the Book of Enoch. Centuries earlier, it talks about this. This Son of God, the Son of Man. You know, this great angel who bears all the trademarks of Yahweh, uh, who will ascend to the highest throne of heaven and sit in judgment over everyone and be the heaven's high priest. All of these things we later see with Jesus. It even says that he ascends to the highest heaven in Philippians 2:9, given his own throne in Hebrews 1:8. Um, and what's really great is in Philippians 2:9, it actually says that he doesn't get the name Jesus until after he's resurrected and ascends into heaven.
Yep.
The name was always kept secret. And this was an idea that went back for centuries. Like if you read the book of Enoch, it talks about how, you know, the the Son of Man, his identity is secret. It's kept from everyone. It's only revealed to certain people, to certain prophets, when they have this weird vision where they ascend into heaven, and the angel Uriel takes them on a tour of the universe, and they eventually learn the true name of Yahweh, and it's this name that is linked with this Son of Man figure. Um, and so when we read things about like the Day of Atonement, where the high priest goes into the temple and behind a closed curtain, he whispers the true name of Yahweh. He might be saying the name Jesus. That might be the secret name of Yahweh that only the high priest is supposed to know. Um, there's this brilliant woman, Dr. Margaret Barker. She's a Methodist minister in the UK.
Yeah, I'm familiar with her work.
Yeah, like honestly,
Israel's second
some of her
God.
books can like seriously give you a headache. They are so dense.
One of the things that
But oh,
go
go ahead.
ahead. Okay, I'll just say real quick that one of the things that she said that I really love about her work is that she said she notes that in the entire New Testament, Jesus is never called the Lord's Son. He is Lord throughout the whole thing.
Right, right. And we actually see in the Gospels where like the demons that he casts out, they recognize him as being son of the God Most High, the son of El Elyon. Well, one of El's sons is Yahweh, and the patron God of Israel, according to Deuteronomy 32:8, is Yahweh, and he was put in that position by his father El Elyon.
Yep.
So it looks like Jesus is a historicized version of the God
Of the Jewish
Yahweh,
God. Yep.
not the son of Yahweh, Yahweh
Himself.
himself. You know, and so once you understand this, all of a sudden these puzzle pieces kind of snap together, and you realize, oh, they're they're taking Yahweh and they're turning him into a mystery cult deity.
Yeah.
And once you understand that, then his battle with Satan, that is Yahweh's ancient battle with
Leviathan.
Leviathan. And that's why they call him, like in Revelation they call him the great dragon. He's referred to as a serpent.
Dragging the third of the angels out of heaven.
Yeah, these were names for Leviathan. The part of the great cosmic battle at the beginning of time where Yahweh killed Leviathan, and Leviathan was supposed to represent the chaotic waters of the primordial earth, and it was then separated, and that's where you have like in Genesis 1 where it talks about how the waters of the earth were separated, and that allowed dry land to emerge. This is a combat myth. This is Yahweh versus Leviathan, Marduk versus Tiamat. These
Right.
are ancient stories. These are creation by combat myths, and it's being updated and then Euhemerized. Jesus versus Satan is Yahweh versus Leviathan. And once you understand that Jesus is not supposed to be the son of Yahweh, that Jesus is supposed to be Yahweh himself, well, then it starts to make a lot more sense. And there are actually references, I believe, in the Psalms that Yahweh might have died in his fight with Leviathan. And it talks about how he had this whole fight, and then all of a sudden the gods and everyone else cheers. Yahweh lives. This was common in these ancient cults when they would have these annual celebrations. When
Right.
their patron deity would rise again after dying. In Babylon, they had their festival of Zagmuk, and it was about Marduk killing Tiamat, and then 3 days later he would, you know, burst forth, and he would survive, and he'd be resurrected, and the people would shout, Marduk lives, and this was um, this was reenacted with the king being re-enthroned. And this was part of a midwinter celebration. And so the king would be like stripped of all of his garments, and there would be this play, and he would pretend to die. Or sometimes they would take a criminal, and the criminal would be executed after being dressed up as the king. And then the king would be like, re-enthroned and get all of his garments and his crown and everything back. And this represented Marduk, ascending into heaven, and himself being enthroned the same way Yahweh ascends to heaven and is enthroned, the same way Jesus ascends to heaven and is enthroned. Um,
It's also very
yeah,
similar to
the,
Baal Hadad, the Canaanite god.
exactly.
Very similar.
And Baal and Yahweh. At this point, I'm not even sure we should consider them separate deities. We actually
I
have
agree
in the
there.
Ugaritic text, uh, there's in one of the texts, I cannot remember the name of the tablet, but El is talking about essentially the enthronement of Baal, and he says, like, from this day you shall be called Yah. Yah was an ancient, it was an honorific. It just means Lord. Now, Baal also means Lord, but apparently Yah was like a higher form of the word. It was a higher title for Lord.
And in the book of
And so,
Hosea, he's identified with
right,
Baal.
right. We also have it in, I believe, was it Second Samuel? The Israelites are going to this battle, and it's like up in the highlands, and it's near this river, and Yahweh helps them break through the enemy lines at this river. And so after that, the this river crossing, it gets renamed. I think it's called like Baal Berith or something like that. So the name Baal is actually in the title, and according to the text itself, according to Second Samuel, it says that means Yahweh broke through. So they're still using Yahweh and Baal interchangeably
Yeah.
as late as Second Samuel. So the the Jews talk about Yahweh and Baal like they're the same deity for a while, and it's only later that they try to make this distinction to try to separate the more modern Yahwistic religion from the old Baal religion.
And the interesting thing
Uh,
about that is the way they separate it is vague. They say they have a problem specifically with people worshiping the idol of Baal.
right,
It doesn't refute that Baal is Yahweh. When the
right,
separation occurs, they have a problem with idolatry specifically.
right. Yeah, because like in Exodus, you know, um, the spirit of Yahweh took the gold and molded it into the form of a golden calf for Aaron. And then the text says, "Oh, and this was wrong, and we had to punish him." Well, you know, if that was wrong, why'd you leave it in the story? It was originally part of the story. It was to explain why they had their great golden calf idols in the Jerusalem temple. We have a whole another origin story for them in First Kings when Solomon, building the temple, has all these metal calves constructed for Yahweh's temple. Yahweh was a bull god,
Yeah.
and this was common imagery for him. And it's only later, after the Persian influence kicks in, where they have this idea where Ahura Mazda, you can't see him, he's invisible. And so they they're trying to update their religion, and they're taking all of these old things that are more associated with the polytheistic portions of it, and the physical presence, and they're pushing that aside. Let's get rid of all the statues of Yahweh and El and Asherah, and Nehushtan, the serpent god in the Garden of Eden, that we see again in Numbers 21 when Moses makes him and puts him on a pole, and it like saves everyone from the snake bites. Let's take all of those deities and shove them aside, because you're only supposed to imagine your God. And one of the things that does is that helps them to centralize worship. Because if you can't make an idol to put up in your house to pray to, you now have to go to a specific temple. And if most of your local shrines have been shut down, then you can centralize worship in a single place. And this is something that actually started around, I think, the 700s BC, when you had a bunch of people who came down from Israel into Judah after the Assyrian conquest. You had all these refugees coming down. The population more than doubled in just a few decades. And there was problems, because all these people, they were doing all of these different things. It was causing conflict. And so the kings were trying to get everything organized. And so they started shutting down shrines. And we actually have archaeological evidence of this. Around the same time period, they were shutting down all of these different shrines. They would take them down. They would bury them in dirt. Some of them were broken, whatever. And they were trying to centralize things so they could kind of get everyone on the same page, because it was impossible to govern when everybody was doing all of these different things. And this is a process. It started then, but it wasn't complete then. It took centuries for that to happen, and it may not have ever actually been completed. Because you actually had like worship of Asherah and some of these other deities all the way up into Christian times. So it's all complicated.
Right. And the Jews, they try to diffuse the Most High and Yahweh as the same God. I mean, by the time we get to
Yeah,
Christianity, they took a crowbar and they separated Yahweh and the
yeah,
Most High back into separate gods, like it was during the pre-exile era,
right,
pre-monotheistic
right.
era.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if the Christians actually separated it again, or if they were one of these remnant groups who had never accepted that El and Yahweh were one deity. Um, and that would explain why they had such animosity toward the temple, because by that point the temple was purely monotheistic, but
Right.
you still had all these different sects of Judaism, who still saw El and Yahweh as separate deities. You
Right.
even had some that were still worshiping Asherah, and Anat, and some of these others,
Right.
like the temple down in Elephantine, Egypt. It talked about Yahweh and his wife Anat, and they were separate from El and Asherah.
She was even,
So
yeah, yeah, she was even called Anat Yahu, like female
yeah, yeah,
Yahweh.
yeah. Anat of Yahoo. So the goddess Anat, the wife of Yahweh. Yeah, because there were multiple ways that they said Yahweh. There was Yahweh, Yahoo, Yah.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's about 4 or 5 that I've seen. I can't remember all of them. Uh, but yeah, this was common. And I think, kind of going back to Margaret Barker, um, she actually has the idea that Mary may have been understood by some early Christians as an earthly incarnation of the goddess Asherah. And if you look at that whole organization, this whole organization of their pantheon, where you have El and his wife Asherah, and they have a son. Their favorite son is Yahweh. Well, Jesus' father, and if Jesus is Yahweh, Jesus' father is El Elyon, and his mother is Mary. Well, if Mary is supposed to be Asherah, then that kind of makes sense. She's the consort of El. But when you get into, I think what's the infancy gospel of James, I believe. Don't quote me on that. It's been a long time since I read it, but one of the infancy gospels, there's this whole big section all about Mary, and it talks about how she lived, like from the time she was a little girl, she lived in the Jerusalem temple, and she was helping to create a new tapestry, a new cloth for the Holy of Holies. A veil. That's the word I'm looking for. She was working on weaving a new veil, um, and it was during this time that the whole Annunciation happens, and the angel comes to her and says she's going to have a son with the help of El, and she dances in joy before the high priest, and it goes on and on and on. All these different things, all about Mary, things that we don't find in the canonical Gospels. But all of these details are things that we already have concerning the goddess Asherah. She's the consort of El. She's associated with weaving. We have these depictions of her holding a spindle, things that we wouldn't even know about Mary. Actually, the early depictions of the Annunciation show her, in front of an angel, and she has a spindle, usually of red thread. Red was one of these colors that was associated with the goddess Asherah. We also have her with these depictions of her with these spindles. We have the scene of her dancing before the high priest, which is just kind of odd. We have a scene in the Ugaritic text about the goddess Asherah dancing before El Elyon, and that the high priest is supposed to be essentially your connection with the great high God. That's the purpose of the priest. So we have all of that, and there are several other different parallels that I can't even recall right now. But we also have things from outside of that text, like in Revelation, where it talks about Mary. They call her the Queen of Heaven, a title for Asherah. It says she's clothed with the sun. What was it? On her head was a crown of 12 stars, and she's clothed with the sun,
Right.
with the moon beneath her feet, I think. Well, th- these are depictions of Asherah, who's always depicted with this splendid robes, brightly colored. She wore stars as jewelry, and some of the depictions of her, she is a winged sun. These things go on and on. We have hymns about Mary, which actually use titles. They call her a great fruit tree, and the waters of life run from her, and she's filled with wisdom. Well, Asherah was a wisdom goddess, often depicted as a fruit tree. It's the parallels, they go on and on and on. And so these early depictions of Mary, they look like they were based on the goddess Asherah. And so that was one of those little fascinating things. So it looks like the story of El and Asherah and Yahweh are just being brought down to earth to be about Mary and Jesus.
Right. I agree. Mary looks like, at the very least, she's taking Asherah's role as being the mother of God. Just,
Right. There's a great book called Temple Theology from Margaret Barker. It's a really thin book, but every word is important. It is one of the densest reads you will ever encounter, and it goes into detail more about this, about Mary as an earthly incarnation of Asherah. I think it's a great place for people to start.
yeah, I love her work. It makes so much sense. Her conclusions make a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah. Um, what's weird is that she's a Christian. She's a Methodist,
Right.
and she talks about this, and I think that I think her belief is like her understanding of Christianity, I think is much closer to early Christians believed than our current understanding of Christianity. I think between her and Michael S. Heiser, they have a very good grasp on what early Christianity actually taught.
Right. All right.
Yeah.
Um, that was pretty good.
Awesome. Awesome.
I loved everything that was discussed. I really do. We should probably do this again at some point. That was really good. And another thing I want, another final thing I want to put in here real quick, and then you can say your final thing, is I did do what you did in the past. When I put the New Testament in order, Paul's letters, then I put Paul's pseudepigraphy, then I put the Gospels.
Hmm.
I came to a very, very similar conclusion to the one you came to. Very similar. There's very little differences between the conclusion I came to and the one you came to. Um, and it's up to the viewers. Do they believe um, that could a Jesus have been mythologized and tangled up in this situation, which is sort of what the consensus scholarship is trying to say? Or was it because he was mythological from the get-go and different historical figures were conflated with him to historicize him?
Hmm.
Those are the two choices I believe we have here.
Right.
What's your final say?
I think any way we look at it, we have a serious knot to untangle. Whether you look at it from the point of view that there was a historical figure who then had multiple layers of myth piled onto him,
Right,
which is not an absurd idea. Nothing about that is ludicrous. That happens all the time,
right,
and it doesn't take long for a person to become mythologized. It can actually happen during a person's own lifetime. Um, Richard Carrier actually notes an example of when a person during his lifetime essentially became a god, despite his objections to the idea. There's nothing absurd about that. Um, but the problem with it is the early Christians didn't seem to believe that. They talk about how Jesus is like he's not known through these different things. He's not known um, from word of mouth. He didn't have disciples. He's not known from this teaching. Romans 16 tells us that everyone knows of Jesus from Scripture. They found him in the Old Testament. And when you read the Old Testament, you read certain parts of it, like Daniel 9, Isaiah 53, Zechariah 6. You see that Jesus is right there, right where Paul said he was. He's in the Old Testament. We just have to pull him out of there and piece them together. And when you do that, you realize that Christianity might not have been something that began in the first century. It might be a continuation of something that is actually centuries older, a Jewish mystery cult that had been surviving in these small communities outside of Jerusalem because they were not allowed in the Jewish temple, which would explain why they have such animosity toward the temple. And when you realize that, then these strange texts, you don't have to explain away the writings of Paul and try to figure out why he talks about Jesus
right.
so strangely. You realize he's saying exactly what many Christians at the time believed. Um, but even if there was a historical Jesus, we still have the mythical Jesus, the celestial figure who was killed up in the firmament, as we see both in the writings of Paul and also in the Ascension of Isaiah, which everyone interested in this topic needs to go and read. And so, even if there was a historical Jesus, there was still a mythical Jesus. And we have such good evidence for it that we can actually piece together his whole story.
And the mythical one took over.
Yeah, and what's great is the mythical one is so much more fun. So if we found out that
Right.
there was a historical Jesus, like if we got definitive proof tomorrow, I would be elated. I wouldn't be disappointed that there was a historical guy and that, mythicism is wrong on the origins of it. I would be elated that we had all this new stuff to talk about. But we still would have this mythical Jesus that other Christians certainly believed in.
Right.
That is the whole foundation of the mythicist argument. So we would still have that to talk about. And that is, in my mind, far more interesting. So if there was a historical figure, awesome.
Hmm.
I still have so much fun with the mythical Jesus that it's just more interesting. Um, so, in a way, you actually could have both.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, all right then. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you
It
for
was, it
having me.
was my pleasure. All right. Thank you everyone for watching, and until next time, I'll see all of you later on to History Valley.